The plantation records were found in a locked cabinet beneath the old courthouse in Savannah, buried under decades of water damage and forgotten paperwork. County Clerk Martha Hayes discovered them during the 1978 renovation, sealed in waxed leather binding that had somehow survived the humidity. What caught her attention wasn't the typical inventory of cotton yields or property transfers. It was a series of notations marked in red ink, all dated between 1831 and 1834. Each entry described the same phenomenon: enslaved children speaking fluent English in what officials called an unknown African tongue. Except these children had been born on American soil. They'd never been to Africa. They'd never been taught. The most disturbing detail wasn't in the plantation ledgers themselves. It was in the medical examiner's reports attached to them, documenting examinations performed on 7 children between the ages of 4 and 9. Each child demonstrated the ability to speak, read, and even write in 2 completely different languages. Each child exhibited identical behavioral patterns, refusing to speak English in certain locations, showing extreme distress when separated from the others, and, according to one doctor's note, displaying knowledge of events and places they could not possibly have witnessed. The records named 14 children in total. 7 were examined. 7 disappeared before they could be. Georgia officials documented everything. Then they locked the files away and never spoke of them again. But somebody knew something. Somebody always knows something. If you're intrigued by stories that challenge everything we think we know about history, make sure you're subscribed. Because what happened in coastal Georgia nearly 2 centuries ago raises questions that historians still can't answer. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the deeper we go into this case, the stranger it becomes. Sarah Pierce arrived in Savannah in March of 1831 with her husband Edmund, a physician from Massachusetts who'd accepted a position as county health inspector. The move represented opportunity. Edmund had been promised a generous salary and a home near the waterfront, far from the overcrowded tenements of Boston, where his medical practice had barely sustained them. Sarah kept detailed journals, a habit she'd maintained since girlhood, filling leather-bound books with observations about their new life in the South. Her early entries paint Savannah as a city of contradictions. The tree-lined streets and elegant townhouses gave way abruptly to sprawling plantations where hundreds of enslaved people worked under conditions Sarah found difficult to witness. She wrote often about the markets, where families were separated and sold, where children stood on auction blocks while buyers examined them like livestock. "It troubles my sleep," she wrote in April of that year. "Edmund tells me I must accustom myself to the customs here, but some customs should not be endured. I see mothers weeping in the streets, their children carried away in wagons. I see men in chains, their faces blank with a grief too deep for expression. How does one accustom oneself to such suffering?" The Pierces rented a modest house on East Broad Street, close to the city center. The building was narrow but comfortable, with tall windows that caught the river breeze and a small garden where Sarah attempted to grow herbs and vegetables. Edmund's work required frequent visits to the surrounding plantations. County health inspectors were responsible for documenting disease outbreaks, examining quarantine cases, and certifying the fitness of enslaved people for heavy labor. It was a role that troubled him, Sarah noted, though he never refused the assignments. The salary, after all, was substantial, and they had debts from Edmund's failed Boston practice that needed settling. In those first months, life in Savannah seemed manageable, even pleasant at times. The city hummed with commerce. Ships arrived daily from Europe and the Caribbean, bringing goods and immigrants. The social scene was active. Dinner parties, theater performances, church socials. The Pierces were welcomed as educated Northerners, though Sarah sensed a certain wariness from their Southern neighbors, particularly when conversations turned to politics or labor systems. The Pierce household employed 2 enslaved women, Martha and Bess, both in their 20s, both born on plantations north of the city. The arrangement had been made by their landlord before they arrived. Martha as cook and housekeeper, Bess as laundry and general labor. Sarah wrote about them with a mixture of sympathy and unease. clearly grappling with her role as a beneficiary of an institution she found morally repugnant. Martha sang while she worked this morning. One entry reads, "A song in a language I did not recognize." When I asked her about it, she fell silent and would not meet my eyes. I pressed her gently, explaining I meant no offense, only curiosity. She finally told me it was something her grandmother used to sing. Words passed down, but meanings lost. "We keep the sounds," she said, "even when we don't know what they mean anymore." The sadness in her voice haunted me all day. Edmund's work brought him into regular contact with the plantation system's brutality. His medical reports from those early months, preserved alongside Sarah's journals in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, document diseases caused by malnutrition, injuries from overwork, infections from inadequate living conditions. He treated children with rickets, adults with untreated broken bones that had healed incorrectly, countless cases of dysentery and fever. His notes are clinical, professional, but Sarah's journals reveal his private struggles. "Edmund came home silent again tonight," she wrote in May. "When I asked about his day, he merely shook his head." Later, after several glasses of whiskey, he told me about a boy of 7 whose arm had been crushed in mill machinery. The arm was infected, needed amputation, but the owner refused to authorize it, claiming the expense wasn't warranted for a child who hadn't yet proven his value. Edmund performed the surgery anyway, without payment. The boy died 3 days later from fever. The coastal region surrounding Savannah had particular characteristics that set it apart from inland Georgia. The sea islands, barrier islands stretching along the coast, had been cultivated for rice and cotton since the early 1700s. The labor was brutal, the climate unforgiving. Malaria and yellow fever killed thousands. Many plantations operated on a task system rather than constant oversight, allowing enslaved people to maintain certain cultural practices that might have been suppressed elsewhere. This created pockets of preserved tradition, languages and customs that originated in West Africa, particularly from regions that are now Sierra Leone, Senegal, and Angola. But what Sarah Pierce would soon encounter had nothing to do with cultural preservation or oral tradition. What she would document in her journals defied every rational explanation that Edmund or anyone else could provide. The city itself had been built on profits from the slave trade. By 1831, Savannah's port ranked among the busiest in the South for cotton exports, and the wealth that trade generated was visible everywhere, in the grand homes along the squares, in the new gas lamps being installed on major streets, in the marble facades of banks and trading houses. But that wealth came at a cost Sarah found increasingly difficult to ignore. "We live in houses built with money earned from human misery," she wrote. "We eat food prepared by hands that are not free. We walk streets cleaned by people who have no choice but to clean them. How long can a society sustain itself on such foundations? How long before the weight of it collapses everything?" She couldn't have known that her question would be answered 3 decades later with a civil war, but her words suggest she sensed something unstable beneath the surface prosperity, some fundamental injustice that couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Edmund's position gave him access to levels of plantation operations most outsiders never saw. He witnessed the full scope of the system, from the auction blocks where families were separated, to the breeding farms where women were forced to produce children who would be sold, to the punishment yards where disobedience was met with violence. His medical training made him valuable to plantation owners, but it also made him complicit in a system he privately opposed. Sarah recorded his internal conflict. He says he helps more by working within the system than he could by refusing to participate. He says his medical care saves lives, alleviates suffering, but I see the cost this takes on his soul. He drinks more than he did in Boston. He sleeps poorly. He flinches at loud sounds. The social fabric of Savannah in 1831 was complex and stratified. At the top were the plantation owners and wealthy merchants, families who'd been in Georgia for generations and controlled most of the land and capital. Below them were professional men like Edmund, Doctors, lawyers, teachers who served the planter class and depended on their patronage. Then came small farmers, artisans, shopkeepers. Free black people occupied a precarious position, legally free but subject to numerous restrictions and constant surveillance. And at the bottom were the enslaved, who outnumbered whites in many coastal counties but had no legal rights, no protections, no recourse against abuse. Sarah's journals document this hierarchy with an outsider's eye. She attended church socials where women discussed their household slaves like furniture. She witnessed street confrontations where free black people were detained and questioned by patrols. She saw children, both black and white, playing together until around age 7, when the social order asserted itself and the casual intimacy of childhood gave way to rigid separation. It was into this world that the strange phenomenon would emerge, challenging assumptions and creating panic among people who thought they understood the system they'd built. The first incident occurred on June 12, 1831, a Thursday morning already hot and humid by the time Edmund received the summons. A rider from Bellbrook Plantation arrived at the Pierce home just after dawn, his horse lathered from hard travel. The overseer, Walter Grimm, had sent an urgent message. 3 children in the slave quarters had fallen ill with symptoms that concerned him: high fever, confusion, and what he described as speaking in tongues. Edmund prepared his medical bag while Sarah insisted on accompanying him. She'd been pestering him for weeks to see the plantations he visited, wanting to document the living conditions she'd only heard about secondhand. Edmund initially resisted, citing the impropriety of a woman observing such conditions, but Sarah had persisted. "If you can witness it, so can I," she'd argued. "And if we're both witness, perhaps we can both testify to the truth of what happens in these places." They rode out in a hired carriage, the journey taking nearly 3 hours on muddy roads still soft from recent rains. The landscape changed gradually as they left Savannah, the developed city giving way to cultivated fields, then to wilder terrain where massive oaks created tunnels of shade over the road. Spanish moss hung from every branch, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that Sarah found both beautiful and unsettling. They passed several smaller plantations, seeing enslaved people working in the fields, before Bellbrook appeared as they crested a small rise. The plantation was larger than Sarah had imagined. A main house of whitewashed brick stood on a gentle hill, 3 stories tall with wide verandas wrapping around each level. Behind it stretched fields in every direction, cotton mostly, but also corn and some rice in the lower, wetter areas. And everywhere, people working under a sun that seemed designed to break the human spirit. Sarah counted over 50 people visible from the road alone. Edmund later told her Bellbrook held nearly 200 enslaved people, making it one of the larger operations in the county. The slave quarters were arranged in 2 rows behind the main house, small wooden structures with mud-chinked walls and roofs of cypress shingles. Vegetable gardens grew between the buildings, small patches where families could supplement the meager rations provided by the plantation. Children too young for field work played in the dirt roads between the buildings, their laughter carrying on the humid air. The contrast between their innocent play and the grim realities of their situation struck Sarah forcefully. Walter Grimm met them at the main house, a hulking man with sunburned skin and hands like slabs of meat. He was in his 40s, Sarah guessed, with the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. He seemed agitated, speaking rapidly as he led Edmund toward the quarters. Sarah followed, despite Grimm's obvious disapproval. "The children are in the sick house," Grimm explained. "Been there since yesterday morning. Won't eat proper. Won't respond when we speak to them. Just keep talking in some, I don't know what it is. African maybe, but none of the others recognize it. And the strange part is..." He paused, glancing back at Sarah as if uncertain whether to continue in her presence. "Go on," Edmund prompted. "They weren't doing this yesterday morning," Grimm said. "They were normal at breakfast, working their tasks. Then right around midday, all 3 of them just stopped. Stopped moving, stopped responding, started speaking this language. Their own mothers don't know what they're saying. The sick house was a separate structure, isolated from the main quarters to prevent the spread of disease. It was smaller than the family cabins, with a single room and no windows, just gaps in the walls for ventilation. Inside, 3 children sat on rough wooden benches. 2 girls, 1 boy, ages appearing to range from 5 to 8. They weren't crying or showing signs of physical distress. They sat perfectly still, hands folded in their laps, staring straight ahead at the opposite wall. And they were speaking, a continuous, rhythmic stream of words in a language Sarah had never heard. The sound of it raised the hairs on the back of her neck. It wasn't random babbling or the fevered nonsense of illness. It had structure, rhythm, melody almost. The words flowed in patterns, repeating certain phrases, building on each other like a conversation or a story being told. But all 3 children spoke in perfect unison, their voices blending together so seamlessly that it was impossible to distinguish individual speakers. Edmund approached slowly, introducing himself in a calm, professional voice. The children didn't acknowledge him. Their eyes remained fixed on the wall. Their mouths continued forming words in that strange, haunting language. Edmund knelt beside the nearest girl, a child who looked about 6 years old with her hair braided in neat rows. He checked her pulse, normal. He looked into her eyes, pupils responsive to light. He tested her reflexes, all normal. She was physically healthy, showing no signs of fever or illness despite Grimm's initial report. Sarah recorded Edmund's findings in the small notebook she'd brought. No elevated temperature, no signs of physical illness, pupils responsive, heartbeats normal and steady, breathing unlabored, yet they appear entirely unreachable, as if their consciousness has been transported elsewhere. Edmund tried various approaches to break through to the children. He asked simple questions about their names, their families, how they felt. He offered them water and food. He tried speaking louder, then softer. Nothing produced any response. The children continued their unified speech, never pausing, never looking away from the wall. Then Edmund tried something different. He stood directly in front of the oldest girl, blocking her view of the wall, and said firmly, "Can you hear me? If you understand English, please respond." For the first time, the unified speech faltered. The other 2 children continued, but the older girl fell silent for perhaps 3 seconds. Then, without breaking her forward stare, without any change in her blank expression, she spoke in perfect, unaccented English. "We hear you. We understand you. We are here." Edmund felt his heart rate accelerate. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Rebecca." The voice was flat, emotionless, as if the answer required no thought. "Rebecca, what are you saying? What language are you speaking?" "The language of remembering." "Who taught you this language?" "No one taught us. We already knew." "That's not possible, Rebecca. All language must be learned. Who taught you?" The girl's eyes finally moved, shifting to look directly at Edmund. The blankness in her expression gave way to something else. Not emotion exactly, but awareness, as if someone behind her eyes had suddenly woken up. "We've always known," she said. "Since before we were born. Since before our mothers were born. We carry it inside. We are vessels for what came before." Then she returned to speaking in the unknown language, rejoining the other 2 children in perfect synchronization. Edmund tried to prompt more responses, but Rebecca didn't speak English again. The 3 children continued their unified chant, seemingly unaware of his presence. Sarah approached the children carefully, sitting on the bench beside the younger girl. She didn't ask questions, just sat quietly, listening to the rhythm of their speech. After several minutes, she began to notice patterns in the unknown language, certain phrases that repeated, certain sounds that seemed to carry emphasis. She tried to transcribe phonetically what she heard, but the sounds were difficult to capture with English letters. "Abakowe," she wrote. "Marenda koloshenda." Edmund spent 2 hours in the sick house, attempting various examinations and interventions. He checked the children's physical responses repeatedly. He tried separating them, moving one to a different corner of the room, but this caused immediate distress. The child began trembling and making a high, keening sound until returned to the group. He tried offering different foods and drinks to see if specific substances affected their state. Nothing worked. The children remained locked in their trance, speaking their mysterious language. Finally, as the afternoon heat became oppressive in the small, poorly ventilated building, Edmund admitted defeat and suggested they return to Savannah to consult his medical texts. Grimm pulled him aside as they were leaving. Sarah couldn't hear the entire conversation, but she caught fragments. "Not the first time this happened." "What do you mean, not the first?" "3 more last week. Different plantation. Owners keeping it quiet." "Why wasn't I notified?" "He don't want word spreading, bad for business. People hear your slaves are speaking in tongues. They think witchcraft, possession, all manner of superstitious nonsense." "This isn't superstition, Mr. Grimm. This is a medical phenomenon that requires investigation." "Maybe so, but the owner, Mr. Porter, he wants them sold before the problem spreads. Already got a buyer lined up from Alabama, leaving next week." "You can't sell sick children." "They ain't sick, doctor. That's the problem. They're healthy as horses. They just won't stop with that speaking. Makes the other slaves nervous. Makes everybody nervous." On the ride back to Savannah, Edmund was uncharacteristically silent. Sarah pressed him for his thoughts, but he seemed genuinely baffled. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple by the time he finally spoke. "The girl spoke English like she'd been educated," he said. "Perfect grammar, sophisticated vocabulary. She said vessels and remembering, abstract concepts. But according to Grimm, none of those children have received any instruction. They work in the fields from age 5. They've never been inside the main house. They've certainly never been taught to read or write." "What was the other language?" Sarah asked. Edmund shook his head. "I don't know. It sounded structured, not random babbling. It had consistent phonemes, grammatical patterns. But I've never heard anything like it, and I've heard most of the African languages that survived here. This was different. Could it be something they created? Children sometimes develop private languages. That crossed my mind. But private languages are usually simplified, childish. This sounded complex, sophisticated, and they spoke in perfect unison, Sarah. That level of coordination suggests either intensive practice or..." He trailed off. "Or what? Or something I don't have a rational explanation for." That night, Sarah wrote in her journal, "Edmund believes it is some form of hysteria or shared delusion, perhaps triggered by the trauma of their circumstances. But I heard those children speak. I watched their faces. Whatever they were saying, they understood it completely. They believed it. And the look in Rebecca's eyes when she spoke to Edmund, that wasn't delusion, that was clarity. As if for a moment, she was more present, more aware than any of us in that room. She spoke of remembering, of carrying something inside, of being vessels. What did she mean? What were they vessels for?" Sarah continued writing late into the night, trying to capture every detail while it was fresh in her memory. She described the rhythm of the unknown language, the synchronized movement of the children's mouths. The blankness in their expressions contrasted with the sudden, sharp awareness in Rebecca's eyes when she switched to English. "I cannot shake the feeling," Sarah wrote, "that we witnessed something significant today. Not illness, not madness, something else. Something that challenges our understanding of how knowledge is acquired and transmitted. Edmund will look for medical explanations, as is his nature and training. But I fear the answer lies outside the realm of medicine. In what realm, I cannot say." The following day, Edmund spent hours in his study, reviewing medical texts on nervous disorders, hysteria, and group delusions. He found case studies of religious ecstasy and mass hysteria in revival meetings, instances of shared hallucinations during fever epidemics, examples of children developing unusual speech patterns due to isolation or abuse. But none of these cases matched what he'd observed. The children at Bellbrook weren't fevered or agitated. They showed no signs of physical trauma. And their language, whatever it was too sophisticated, too structured to be dismissed as nonsense. Sarah, meanwhile, became consumed with the mystery. She began asking Martha and Bess about languages they'd heard on plantations, about stories passed down through generations, about any instances they'd heard of children speaking in unknown tongues. Martha was reluctant to discuss it at first, but eventually, after Sarah assured her the conversation would remain private, she revealed that such things weren't entirely unheard of. "My grandmother told me stories," Martha said quietly, glancing toward the door as if afraid of being overheard. "About children who remembered things they shouldn't know. About old languages that survived even when no one spoke them anymore. She said the ancestors don't forget, even when we do. She said sometimes they speak through those who'll listen." "Do you believe that?" Sarah asked. Martha hesitated. "I believe there are things white folks don't understand about us, things we keep to ourselves, things that survived the crossing, even when they tried to take everything else from us." "What things survived?" "Memory," Martha said simply. "You can take away our names, our families, our freedom, but you can't take away what we remember, and what we remember we pass down, sometimes in stories, sometimes in songs, and sometimes—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Sometimes in ways that don't make sense to you, but make perfect sense to us." This conversation haunted Sarah. She wrote about it extensively, trying to understand what Martha was suggesting. "She speaks of memory as if it's something tangible, something that can be preserved and transmitted across generations," Sarah wrote. "But memory is individual, isn't it? We remember our own experiences, not the experiences of our ancestors. And yet, what if there are forms of remembering we don't understand? What if trauma, particularly trauma experienced collectively by many people, creates some kind of imprint, some kind of knowledge that persists even when those who experienced it firsthand are gone?" Edmund dismissed this line of thinking as unscientific. "Memory is a function of the brain," he insisted. "It's biological, chemical. It can't be inherited or transmitted except through direct teaching and learning. What you're describing would require some kind of spiritual or supernatural mechanism, and such things don't exist." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She'd seen Rebecca's eyes. She'd heard the language those children spoke, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond ordinary medical science was at work. Over the following weeks, Edmund received similar calls from other plantations in the region. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. Enslaved children, ranging in age from 4 to 9, entering trance-like states and speaking in 2 languages, English and the same unknown tongue Edmund had heard at Bellbrook. The children were always born on American soil, always from different families, always showing the same behavioral characteristics. The second incident occurred on June 19th at Riverside Plantation, 12 miles west of Savannah. 2 children this time, both boys, ages 7 and 8. They'd been working in the vegetable garden when they suddenly stopped, sat down in the dirt, and began speaking the language. The overseer had tried shaking them, shouting at them, even threatening them with punishment, but nothing broke through. They sat in the garden for 6 hours before their mother finally convinced the overseer to send for Edmund. By the time Edmund arrived, the boys had been moved to a storage shed. They sat side by side on the dirt floor, still speaking in perfect synchronization. Edmund performed his examinations and found the same results as before. No physical illness, no fever, no signs of trauma. When he tried asking questions in English, the older boy responded, but the response was chilling. "We see what happened here," the boy said, his voice flat and distant. "We see the ones who came before us. We see what was done to them. We remember." "Remember what?" Edmund asked. "Everything. The ships, the markets, the beatings, the ones who died, the ones who lived but wished they hadn't. We carry their memories. We speak their words." "That's impossible. You're too young to remember such things. You weren't alive when—" "We've always been alive," the boy interrupted. "We died and came back. We came back so someone would remember, so someone would speak." Then he returned to the unknown language, leaving Edmund shaken and confused. The third incident occurred on June 24th at Thornton Fields, a cotton plantation southeast of Savannah. 4 children this time, ages ranging from 4 to 8. The overseer's report mentioned that the children had been found standing in the cotton field at dawn, arranged in a circle, all speaking the same words simultaneously. They'd been standing there for an unknown period, possibly all night, though no one could confirm when they'd left their cabin. Edmund brought Sarah with him this time, recognizing that her approach with the children yielded different information than his clinical examinations. They found the 4 children sitting in the plantation's chapel, a small wooden structure where enslaved people were required to attend Sunday services. The children sat in the front pew, their hands folded, speaking their unified language. But this time, something was different. Every few minutes the unified speech would pause, and one child would speak a few sentences in English before the group resumed their chanting. Sarah sat in the pew behind them and listened. The English sentences were fragments, disconnected but haunting. "We walked for days, and the sun burned our skin. They put chains around our necks. The water was too salty to drink. My mother's name was lost." Each fragment seemed to describe a different experience, a different memory, and each was delivered in the same flat, emotionless tone, as if the children were reading from some vast, terrible book of accumulated suffering. Edmund attempted to document the phenomenon scientifically, recording the timing of the episodes, the duration of the trances, the exact words spoken. But Sarah focused on a different kind of documentation. She tried to understand what the children were experiencing, not just observing their behavior. After several hours, when the trance briefly lifted and the children seemed more present, Sarah approached the youngest girl and asked gently, "Do you know where you are right now?" The girl looked confused for a moment, glancing around the chapel as if seeing it for the first time. "I was somewhere else," she said. "I was on a boat. It was dark and crowded and people were crying. Then I was standing in a line and people were looking at my teeth. Then I was here. Do you remember those things happening to you? They didn't happen to me. They happened before, but I remember them like they happened to me. How is that possible?" The girl's expression became troubled. "I don't know, but when it happens it feels real. It feels like I'm there, like I'm living it. And the words just come. I don't choose them. They're just there." By July, local plantation owners were in a panic. Rumors spread quickly in the tight-knit community of landowners and overseers. The issue was primarily financial. Children exhibiting abnormal behavior couldn't be sold at full value, and their presence in the quarter supposedly disturbed the other enslaved people. Several plantation owners had already moved affected children to isolated locations, keeping them away from the general population. Edmund compiled detailed notes on each case. Sarah, now accompanying him on every call, served as his assistant and recorder. Together, they documented 14 children across 6 plantations. The geographic distribution was telling. All the plantations were located within a 20-mile radius of Savannah, all near the Ogeechee River, all established before 1800. The children had no apparent connection to each other. Their families came from different African regions, arrived on different ships decades apart, worked different crops under different systems, but the language was identical. Edmund made extensive recordings using written phonetics, filling dozens of pages with approximations of the sounds. When he consulted with scholars at the Savannah Medical Society, no one could identify it. Dr. Henry Walters, the Society's president, suggested it might be a form of religious ecstasy similar to phenomena documented at revival meetings. Dr. James Thurston proposed it could be a neurological condition affecting speech centers in the brain. Dr. William Cross theorized it might be deliberate deception, a coordinated effort by enslaved adults to cause disruption with the children as unwitting participants. Edmund sent samples of his phonetic transcriptions to colleagues in Charleston and Boston. One professor from the College of Charleston suggested it might be a Creole language, a mixture of multiple African tongues blended with English and Portuguese. But that didn't explain the children's fluency or the synchronized nature of their speech. Creole languages developed gradually through interaction between different language groups. These children were speaking as if they'd been fluent since birth. A linguist at Harvard, Dr. Samuel Williams, sent an intriguing response. He noted that the phonetic patterns Edmund described bore similarities to several West African language families, particularly the Manda and Bantu groups, but he also identified sounds and structures that didn't match any known African language. "It's as if," Dr. Williams wrote, "the language you've documented contains elements from multiple sources, synthesized into something new, or perhaps something very old that has evolved over time. I would need to hear it spoken directly to make any definitive analysis." The behavioral patterns were equally disturbing. Each child, when in the trance state, would speak the unknown language continuously for hours, sometimes days. They accepted food and water but showed minimal interest in normal activities. They didn't play, didn't interact with siblings, didn't respond to comfort or punishment. Then, as suddenly as it began, the trance would break. The children would return to normal behavior, working, playing, speaking English as they had before. But they retained no conscious memory of what they'd said during the episodes, or at least they claimed to have no memory. Sarah discovered otherwise. Through patient and gentle conversation, always conducted away from overseers and plantation owners, she learned that the children did remember. They just couldn't talk about it without triggering fear or another episode. When pressed carefully, several children admitted to having vivid dreams that preceded the trance states. "The same dream every night," one girl told Sarah. "There's a place with water all around, big buildings made of stone, people wearing white clothes, and somebody teaching us words, so many words. They put the words inside us." Another boy described seeing the ones who came before, people he'd never met but somehow recognized. "They show us things," he said, "things that happened long time ago, things that hurt. They want us to remember. They say if we don't remember, then it didn't happen, and if it didn't happen, then they died for nothing." When Sarah asked what things they were being shown, the boy became visibly distressed. "Chains," he whispered, "and dark places, and water that goes on forever, and people falling. So many people falling." Sarah reported these conversations to Edmund, but he remained skeptical. "Children have vivid imaginations," he said, "particularly children living in traumatic circumstances. They create fantasy worlds as an escape mechanism. These dreams and visions are likely their mind's way of processing the very real suffering they witness daily. But the language, Edmund, the identical language spoken by 14 different children, how do you explain that? I don't know yet. But there must be a rational explanation. There's always a rational explanation." Sarah wasn't convinced. She continued her interviews, building trust with the children through gentle persistence. One conversation particularly stood out. It was with a boy named Daniel, age 8, from Fairfield Plantation. Daniel had experienced 3 separate trance episodes, each lasting multiple days. During a lucid period, Sarah sat with him in the shade of an oak tree while Edmund examined other children nearby. "Do you want to tell me what it's like?" Sarah asked, "when you're speaking the other language?" Daniel was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "It's like being many people at once, like I'm me but I'm also them, the ones who came before. I can feel what they felt. I can see what they saw. And the language, it just comes from inside. It's like it was always there, just waiting for me to find it." "Does it scare you?" "Sometimes. Sometimes it feels good. Like I'm not alone. Like I'm part of something bigger. But other times..." He trailed off, staring at his hands. "Other times what?" "Other times I remember things that hurt so much I can't breathe. Things done to people like me. Things that shouldn't happen to anyone. And I want to scream, but the words come out in the language instead, and I don't know how to make it stop." Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm sorry for what you're experiencing. I'm sorry for..." She gestured helplessly at the plantation around them, unable to articulate the magnitude of her horror at the entire system. Daniel looked at her with ancient eyes. You don't have to be sorry, Miss Sarah. You didn't put us here. But maybe you can help people understand. Maybe you can write it down so people know. We're remembering so it's not forgotten. Maybe you can remember too. And that conversation stayed with Sarah for the rest of her life. In journals written decades later, she would return to Daniel's words, analyzing them, trying to understand what the boy had been asking of her. He gave me a task, she wrote in 1862. A task I'm still trying to fulfill, to remember, to bear witness, to ensure that what happened wasn't forgotten. But how does one remember atrocities one never witnessed? How does one testify to suffering one didn't experience? And yet, that's exactly what those children were doing, remembering what they hadn't witnessed, testifying to suffering they hadn't personally experienced. Perhaps that's what memory truly is. Not just our own experiences, but the accumulated experiences of everyone who came before us. By August, the situation had evolved from a medical curiosity to a potential crisis. Plantation owners were demanding answers. Some threatened to take legal action against Edmund, claiming his examinations had somehow triggered or worsened the condition. Others spread rumors that he was a secret abolitionist, using medical pretexts to cause disruption. The tension was palpable at medical society meetings, where Edmund's colleagues divided between those who supported his investigations and those who thought he should drop the matter entirely. 7 of the 14 children had been scheduled for examination by a visiting physician from Charleston, Dr. Lawrence Bennett, a specialist in nervous disorders who'd published papers on hysteria and mental disturbances in enslaved populations. Dr. Bennett had gained some notoriety for theories about racial differences in brain function, arguing that enslaved people were biologically predisposed to certain mental conditions due to their primitive origins. Edmund privately found Bennett's theories abhorrent, but professional courtesy and pressure from plantation owners required accepting his colleagues' involvement. The examinations were scheduled for August 20th at Riverside Plantation, where the necessary facilities could be prepared. But before the examinations could take place, something happened that changed everything. 4 of the children disappeared. The disappearances occurred over a single night, August 15th to 16th, 1831. 4 children from 3 different plantations simply vanished from locked quarters. Rebecca from Bellbrook, the girl who'd first spoken to Edmund. Daniel from Fairfield, who'd asked Sarah to remember. And 2 children from Riverside, siblings, a boy and girl named Jacob and Mary. The quarters were always secured at night, a common practice to prevent runaways. Heavy wooden doors with external bolts, windows too small for anyone but the youngest children to fit through. Yet somehow these 4 got out without alerting anyone. No sounds of breaking wood, no signs of forced entry when the doors were examined the following morning. The bolts were still in place, slid home as if the children had somehow passed through solid wood. At Bellbrook, Rebecca's mother woke at dawn to find her daughter's sleeping mat empty. She initially assumed Rebecca had woken early to use the privy, but when she didn't return after several minutes, the mother went to check. Rebecca was nowhere on the plantation grounds. The alarm was raised immediately. Within an hour, similar reports came from Fairfield and Riverside. 4 children, all previously exhibiting the trance behavior, all gone. Slave patrols were mobilized before noon. Groups of armed men on horseback spread out in all directions from the 3 plantations, searching roads, fields, and wooded areas. Bloodhounds were brought in from as far as Brunswick, 40 miles south. The dogs picked up scents at all 3 locations, but quickly lost the trails in confusing patterns that led in circles before simply stopping, as if the children had vanished into thin air. Edmund was questioned by the county sheriff, Hiram Cobb, a large man with a red face and hands that gestured constantly as he spoke. Cobb arrived at the Pierce home on the evening of August 16th, accompanied by 2 deputies. He was polite but clearly suspicious. "You've been to every plantation where this strangeness occurred," Cobb pointed out. "You've examined all these children, spoken with them privately. Maybe you know more than you're saying. Maybe you've been telling them things, putting ideas in their heads." Edmund defended himself with barely contained anger. Sheriff, I'm a physician. My job is to examine and treat, not to facilitate escapes. I've documented every visit, every examination in detailed medical records. Would you like to review them? Maybe I would. Edmund spent the next hour showing Cobb his notes, his correspondence with other physicians, Sarah's journal entries documenting their observations. Sarah provided an alibi for the night of the disappearances. They'd been home together, had retired early after Edmund came down with a headache. Their housemaid Bess confirmed she'd served them dinner and heard Edmund in his study until nearly 10 o'clock. Eventually, Cobb's suspicions shifted. If not you, then who? Children don't just disappear from locked buildings. Somebody helped them. Somebody planned this. Have you considered they might have had help from within? Edmund suggested. From other enslaved people on the plantations? We've questioned everyone. Threatened punishment if anyone's hiding information. Nobody's talking. Either they don't know, or they're too scared to tell. The prevailing theory among plantation owners was organized abolitionist activity. The early 1830s saw increasing tensions over slavery, though the organized underground railroad networks wouldn't fully develop for another decade. Still, there were known abolitionists in the area. Quaker families, free black communities, some northern merchants with anti-slavery sympathies. Several plantation owners formed a committee to investigate these suspected groups, conducting searches and making accusations, though nothing concrete emerged. But Sarah noticed details that didn't fit the escape narrative. Over the following week, she revisited the 3 plantations where the disappearances occurred, ostensibly to support Edmund's continued investigations, but actually to conduct her own interviews. She spoke with enslaved people who'd been in adjacent quarters, who'd lived and worked alongside the missing children. Their stories were consistent and deeply strange. I heard nothing that night, one woman from Bellbrook told Sarah. And that's what was strange. Usually you hear everything. People snoring, babies crying, mice in the walls. But that night was silent like nothing I ever experienced. Silent like death. Another woman described waking with an overwhelming sense of wrongness. Couldn't say what it was. Just a feeling that something important was happening. I tried to wake my husband, but couldn't move. Felt like something was holding me down. Not in a bad way, more like being told to stay still. Don't look. Let it happen. A man from Riverside reported waking to find his youngest daughter, one of the 7 remaining children who'd exhibited the trance behavior, standing at the window of their cabin, staring out into the darkness. When he asked her what she was looking at, she said, "They're leaving now." He looked outside and saw nothing but the empty yard bathed in moonlight. "Who's leaving?" he asked her. "The ones who were ready," she replied, then went back to sleep. When he questioned her about it the next morning, she had no memory of the incident. Most disturbing was an account from a field hand at Fairfield named Joseph. He'd been outside that night, technically violating the rules but taking a few minutes of fresh air after feeling sick. He was behind his cabin, out of sight of the overseer's house, when he saw something he couldn't explain. "I saw the boy, Daniel, walking," Joseph told Sarah, speaking very quietly and glancing around constantly to ensure no one else was listening. He was walking toward the woods, but he wasn't alone. There were others with him. Not people exactly, but shapes, like people made of shadow. They were all around him, walking with him, and he was speaking that language, the one he'd been speaking during his spells, speaking it like he was in conversation with those shadows. "Did you try to stop him?" Sarah asked. Joseph shook his head. "I was scared. I know that sounds cowardly, but something about what I was seeing, it wasn't natural, wasn't something I wanted to interfere with. And Daniel, he looked peaceful, like he wanted to be going wherever he was going. I watched until they reached the tree line, and then they just weren't there anymore. Didn't walk into the woods, just weren't there." "Did you report this?" "To who?" "The overseer. He'd whip me for being outside at night." "The sheriff?" "He'd think I was crazy or lying. I kept my mouth shut, only telling you because you seem like you actually care what happens to us. But I don't expect you to believe me." "I believe you," Sarah said quietly. And she did. The account matched too many other strange details. The silence, the sense of wrongness, the inexplicable nature of the vanishings. The searches continued for 2 weeks, covering an ever-widening radius from the plantations. Rewards were offered, $50 per child, a substantial sum. Notices were posted at courthouses throughout Georgia and into South Carolina. But no trace of the 4 children was ever found. No witnesses reported seeing them on roads or in towns. No one attempted to claim the rewards. It was as if Rebecca, Daniel, Jacob, and Mary had simply ceased to exist. Edmund was devastated by the disappearances. He blamed himself, though Sarah insisted that wasn't rational. "You were trying to help them," she argued. "You were trying to understand what they were experiencing. And in the process, I drew attention to them, made them objects of scrutiny, made them valuable as medical curiosities. Maybe that's why they ran. Maybe they were escaping from me as much as from anything else. You don't know that. You can't know that." But Edmund's guilt persisted. It affected his work, his sleep, his relationship with Sarah. He began drinking more heavily, sometimes finishing a bottle of whiskey in a single evening. Sarah's journal entries from this period document her worry. Edmund is not well. The disappearances haunt him. He sees those children in his dreams, he tells me, sees them calling out to him, asking why he couldn't help them. I try to comfort him, but my words feel inadequate. How does one comfort someone grieving for children they barely knew but feel responsible for? The medical examinations were postponed indefinitely. Dr. Bennett, the specialist from Charleston, sent word that he was no longer interested in the case, citing insufficient reliable data and concerns about professional reputation. Several of Edmund's colleagues at the Medical Society distanced themselves, worried that association with such a controversial matter might damage their practices. Plantation owners became increasingly reluctant to report new cases. Sarah suspected there were additional incidents that went undocumented. Children exhibiting the trance behavior who were quickly punished or isolated, their conditions hidden to avoid drawing more attention. The economic calculations were simple. Children speaking in unknown tongues couldn't be sold at full value. Better to hide the problem or deal with it privately than involve outside authorities. Of the 10 remaining children, 3 were sold quickly to plantations further inland. Their owners, desperate to move them off the property, accepted reduced prices and asked no questions about why buyers were willing to take on potentially problematic slaves. Edmund protested these sales in a letter to the county commissioners, arguing that the children required continued observation and treatment, but his concerns were overruled. The medical interest does not supersede property rights, the commission's response stated coldly. By September, only 7 children remained in the coastal area, the ones whose owners couldn't or wouldn't sell them, either because they were too young to have significant value or because family relationships made selling them particularly cruel, even by the loose standards of the plantation system. These 7 became the focus of Edmund's continued investigations, though he now worked with much less institutional support. Edmund petitioned the county commissioners to have these 7 children brought together for concentrated examination, proposing that they be housed temporarily at the county infirmary. He argued that consolidated observation would allow for more systematic study and potentially lead to treatment options. He also argued, more quietly, in conversations with sympathetic commissioners, that the children might be safer in a controlled medical environment than scattered across plantations where overseers might take punitive action against them for their unusual behavior. To Edmund's surprise, the petition was approved. The official reason was quarantine and treatment of a contagious nervous condition. The real reason, Sarah suspected, was that officials wanted answers. Important men were worried. Some genuinely wanted to help. Others wanted to understand whether the phenomenon represented a larger threat to the social order. And worried men with power tend to take action, whether or not it's justified. The children were transported to the Savannah County Infirmary in early October. The facility, a 2-story brick building near the waterfront, typically housed indigent patients and sailors recovering from tropical diseases brought in from Caribbean ports. A separate wing was cleared for the children, 6 small rooms on the second floor, originally meant for quarantine cases. The windows were barred, though supposedly for the patient's protection rather than to prevent escape. Edmund was granted full authority to conduct whatever examinations he deemed necessary, with funding provided by a combination of county resources and private donations from plantation owners hoping for answers. Sarah assisted as unofficial nurse and recorder, her journals providing the only comprehensive account of what happened during those 6 weeks. She also served as advocate for the children, ensuring they received adequate food, clothing, and as much comfort as the institutional setting allowed. She brought books from home, taught several children to read basic words, spent hours simply talking with them about their lives, their families, their hopes. Her journals from this period show deep affection for these children, mixed with anguish at their circumstances. The 7 children ranged in age from 4 to 9. Their names, as recorded in Sarah's journals: Thomas, age 8, Rachel, age 7, Elizabeth, age 9, James, age 6, Hannah, age 5, Samuel, age 7, and Abigail, age 4. They came from 5 different plantations and represented several different African ethnic origins based on family histories Edmund was able to piece together. None of them had known each other before being brought to the infirmary. Yet within days, they bonded with an intensity that surprised everyone. They moved as a group, ate together, slept in adjacent rooms with doors left open so they could hear each other. When one experienced a trance episode, the others would gather around, joining in the unknown language until the episode passed. It was as if they recognized each other as part of some larger community, connected by their shared experiences of the phenomenon. The experiments, for they were experiments, though Edmund called them examinations, began immediately. Edmund was methodical, approaching the problem as a medical puzzle requiring systematic investigation. He tested the children's literacy, their memory, their physical responses to various stimuli. He separated them, then brought them together, documenting whether proximity affected the frequency and intensity of trance episodes. He tried teaching them new words in different languages to see if their unusual linguistic abilities extended beyond the 2 languages they already spoke. The results were deeply unsettling. All 7 children could read. Not simple words like cat or dog, they could read full sentences, complex passages. Edmund presented them with books from his personal library, medical texts, poetry collections, even a copy of Gulliver's Travels. When reading English, the children demonstrated comprehension appropriate to their ages, sometimes slightly advanced. Elizabeth, the oldest, could read and understand passages from Edmund's anatomy textbook. Samuel correctly answered questions about a poem by William Wordsworth. Hannah, only 5 years old, followed along with a children's primer and sounded out unfamiliar words with impressive phonetic accuracy. But the truly shocking discovery came when Edmund presented them with written samples of the unknown language. He'd been transcribing the language phonetically for months, developing a system of symbols and combinations to represent sounds that didn't exist in English. On impulse, he showed one of his transcriptions to Thomas. The boy looked at the page for a long moment, then began reading aloud, fluently, with perfect pronunciation, as if he'd been reading that language all his life. "Thomas, how do you know these words?" Edmund asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just know them," Thomas replied. "Like I know English words. They're inside my head." Edmund tested the other children. Every single one could read the transcriptions fluently. They could also write in the language when given paper and pencil, though their writing was somewhat childish and uneven. The limitations of small hands and limited practice, not lack of linguistic knowledge. "This is impossible," Edmund wrote in his notes dated October 12, 1831. "These children have received no formal education. The plantations they came from don't permit literacy among enslaved populations. It's actually illegal in Georgia to teach enslaved people to read or write. Yet they read with confidence and understanding in both English and this unknown language. Where did this knowledge come from? How is it possible? He examined their educational histories more carefully, interviewing their mothers and other family members when possible. Every account was the same. The children had never been taught to read. They'd never been inside plantation main houses where books might be accessible. They'd never attended any kind of school or received any kind of instruction beyond basic commands related to their work assignments. Yet they could read. Somehow, they could read. The children themselves provided no useful explanations, at least not explanations that satisfied Edmund's need for rational answers. During lucid periods, they claimed not to remember what they said during trance episodes. But Sarah, through patient and gentle conversation conducted privately in their rooms, learned something Edmund's clinical approach missed. The children weren't unaware of what was happening to them. They were terrified. "Will they hurt us?" Elizabeth asked Sarah during a quiet evening conversation. "For knowing things we're not supposed to know?" "What things, Elizabeth? What do you know?" The girl looked around nervously, as if checking for listeners even though they were alone in her small room. "About the others. About what happened to them. About why we remember." "Remember what?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "Everything. We remember everything. The ships, the markets, the work that kills people, the children sold away from their mothers, the beatings, the starving, the dying. We remember all of it, even though it didn't happen to us. It happened to people before us. And it's still happening, and we can't stop seeing it." Sarah reached out and took the girl's hand. "Who shows you these things?" "I don't know. They're just there, in my head. Like memories, but not my memories. And when we speak the language, it's like we're telling the stories that nobody else tells. The stories people want to forget. Does it hurt? Yes, but not like being hit hurts. It hurts like caring too much about something that's too big to fix. Do you know what I mean?" Sarah did know. She squeezed Elizabeth's hand and blinked back her own tears. "I think I do." Similar conversations with the other children revealed consistent themes. They all experienced vivid, intrusive memories of events they hadn't witnessed. They all felt compelled to speak the unknown language, describing it as something that needed to come out, like words building up inside them until they had to be released. They all spoke of the ones who came before, ancestors or predecessors who somehow communicated through them. And they were all afraid. Afraid of punishment for their unusual behavior. Afraid of being separated from each other. Afraid of what the memories showed them. Afraid of what would happen when the examinations ended and they had to return to the plantations. "We can't go back," James told Sarah one day. "If we go back, they'll hurt us. They'll think we're trouble. They'll sell us far away where no one knows us." "Edmund won't let that happen," Sarah assured him, though she wasn't certain that was true. "Miss Sarah, adults can't protect us. You know that. Adults say they'll protect us. But then bad things happen anyway. We're not even supposed to be people. We're property. Property doesn't get protected." The profound sadness and wisdom in the 6-year-old's words haunted Sarah for years. In later journals, she would return to this conversation again and again, recognizing James's assessment as devastatingly accurate. The children understood their situation far better than she'd initially realized. They knew exactly how little power Edmund or anyone else had to ensure their safety in a system that didn't recognize their humanity. On October 23rd, the nature of the trance episodes changed dramatically. Instead of lasting hours or days, they became brief and intense, flashes of the unknown language spoken urgently, almost desperately, followed by rapid returns to lucidity. The children began experiencing what Edmund termed dual consciousness. They could speak both languages simultaneously, alternating between English and the unknown tongue mid-sentence, as if two different minds were operating through one voice. Edmund documented one particularly striking episode with Thomas. During a routine physical examination, Thomas suddenly stopped mid-response and said in English, "I remember the ship." Then, in the unknown language, a rapid burst of words lasting perhaps 5 seconds. Then back to English. "We were in the dark. So many days in the dark. The smell made us sick. People dying all around us. More of the unknown language, longer this time, the words tumbling out urgently. Then, they threw some overboard, the sick ones. I remember the water closing over their faces. I remember the crying. He cut off abruptly, his eyes going wide with terror, and he wouldn't speak again for the rest of the day. But Thomas had been born in Georgia. He'd never been on a ship. His mother, when questioned, confirmed he'd been born on the same plantation where he'd lived his entire 8 years. She'd never been on a ship either. She was second-generation American-born, her parents having arrived in the 1770s. There was no family history that could explain Thomas's memory of the Middle Passage. Edmund tried to rationalize it. He's heard stories, he suggested to Sarah. Older slaves talk about the crossing. He's absorbed those stories and is now remembering them as if he experienced them himself. It's a form of false memory. But the details, Edmund. He described specific sensations, the smell, the darkness, the way the water looked when people were thrown overboard. Those aren't the kinds of details transmitted through casual storytelling. Then perhaps he has a remarkably vivid imagination. Or perhaps he's actually remembering something that happened to someone else, but remembering nonetheless. Edmund shook his head, unwilling to accept an explanation that violated everything he understood about how human memory functioned. But over the following days, similar episodes occurred with all 7 children. They each described experiences from the Middle Passage, from slave markets, from punishments witnessed, from family separations. And the details were consistent, specific, verifiable in ways that suggested these weren't fantasies or retellings of secondhand stories. Samuel described a specific slave market in Charleston, including details about the building's architecture and the auctioneer's appearance that Edmund later confirmed through historical records. Rachel described a punishment involving a specific device Edmund had never heard of, but which, after consultation with plantation owners, turned out to be a real implement used on some estates. Hannah, only 5 years old, described a fever outbreak on a rice plantation that matched documented incidents from 20 years earlier. The children were accessing information they couldn't possibly have learned through normal means, and they were speaking a language no one had taught them. The mystery was deepening rather than resolving. Sarah began to develop a comprehensive theory, one she worked on in her journal over many late nights. What if, she wrote, the phenomenon we're witnessing isn't supernatural or even particularly mysterious once we understand the mechanism? What if profound collective trauma creates a kind of shared knowledge base that can be accessed by descendants of those who experienced the trauma? Not transmitted consciously through teaching, but encoded somehow in the very being of people whose ancestors suffered these experiences. She continued, Edmund insists that memory is purely individual, biological, chemical. But what if that's not the complete picture? What if there are forms of knowledge transmission we don't yet understand? We know that children inherit physical characteristics from their parents, height, eye color, predispositions to certain diseases. What if they also inherit something less tangible? Memories, perhaps, or echoes of memories, the accumulated experiences of everyone who came before them. It was a radical theory, one that wouldn't begin to find scientific support until more than a century later, with the discovery of epigenetics and research into intergenerational trauma. But Sarah, working only from observation and intuition, had stumbled onto something profound. Edmund remained skeptical. Memory doesn't work like that, he insisted. Individuals remember experiences they personally witness. They can't remember events they never witnessed, experiences they never had. But what if there's something we don't understand about how consciousness functions? Sarah countered. What if individual consciousness is less isolated than we assume? What if, under certain conditions, people can access a broader pool of experiences? That's mystical thinking, Sarah. That's the kind of unscientific speculation that leads to seances and spirit mediums and all manner of superstitious nonsense. Or perhaps it's thinking that's ahead of our current scientific understanding. Perhaps in 50 years, 100 years, what seems mystical now will have perfectly rational explanations. Their arguments became more frequent as the investigation progressed. Edmund felt his professional reputation was already damaged by association with the case, and he wasn't willing to entertain theories that might make him seem even less credible. Sarah felt he was allowing his concern for reputation to blind him to genuine phenomena that deserved investigation. The situation deteriorated further when the children started demonstrating what could only be described as precognition. It started small, accurately stating when visitors would arrive at the infirmary before any messenger had announced them, knowing what Edmund had eaten for breakfast, despite being locked in their wing with no possible way of observing him. Rachel told Sarah one morning that a woman with yellow hair would bring them fresh bread that afternoon. At 2 o'clock, a blonde woman from a nearby church arrived with donated food, including several loaves of fresh-baked bread. Then the predictions became more significant and disturbing. On October 28th, Hannah told Edmund that a man with a damaged eye would come to the infirmary and cause trouble. 2 days later, a one-eyed sailor suffering from fever-induced delirium attacked a nurse in the ground-floor ward, causing significant disruption before being restrained by orderlies. On November 1st, Samuel said that someone important would die and everyone would be sad. The next morning, news arrived that a prominent plantation owner, Colonel Richard Hayes, had died suddenly of heart failure during the night. Edmund tried to rationalize these predictions as coincidence or lucky guesses. One-eyed sailors aren't uncommon in a port city. Fever patients frequently become delirious. Important men die regularly. But there were too many predictions, too specific and accurate, for coincidence to be a satisfying explanation. The children also began drawing pictures during their free time, using paper and pencils Sarah had provided. Their drawings were disturbing. Ships with people crowded into holds, chains and whips, families being separated, buildings on fire. But mixed in with these traumatic images were drawings of places none of the children had ever seen. Architectural structures that looked like nothing in Georgia, landscapes with unfamiliar vegetation, people in clothing styles from Africa or the Caribbean. Sarah saved these drawings, storing them carefully in a folder she labeled Children's Documentation. Many decades later, anthropologists examining the drawings would identify specific architectural styles from coastal West Africa, clothing patterns from various African cultures, and landscape features matching regions of modern Senegal and Sierra Leone. The children were drawing places they'd never been, cultures they'd never been taught about, with a level of detail that suggested intimate familiarity. On November 3rd, all 7 children simultaneously entered a trance state that lasted 18 hours. It began without warning just after breakfast. Sarah was reading to them in the common area of their wing when all 7 suddenly fell silent, stood up, and arranged themselves in a circle. They held hands and began speaking the unknown language in perfect unison, their voices blending together in a continuous rhythmic chant. Edmund and Sarah took turns monitoring them, recording as much as possible. The phonetic transcriptions filled dozens of pages. The children showed no signs of distress, but they also showed no signs of individual consciousness. They moved in coordination, turned their heads at the same moments, even blinked in synchrony. It was as if a single awareness animated all 7 bodies. Edmund tried various interventions. He attempted to separate them, but any effort to pull one child from the circle was met with immediate, intense resistance, not violent, but like trying to pull apart magnets. He spoke to them, asked questions, even tried physically examining them while they stood in the circle, but received no response. They were completely unreachable. The chanting continued through lunch, through dinner, through the night. Sarah stayed with them the entire time, dozing fitfully in a chair while the children's unified voices filled the ward. She tried recording the sounds more carefully, listening for patterns or repetitions. Around 3 in the morning, she noticed something remarkable. The chanting had a structure like poetry or song. Certain phrases repeated at regular intervals. The rhythm was complex but consistent. It was clearly a composed piece of language, not random utterance. When dawn broke on November 4th, the trance suddenly ended. The children released hands, swayed slightly, and then sat down on the floor where they stood. They looked exhausted but coherent. Edmund examined them thoroughly, finding no physical explanation for what had occurred. Their pulses were slightly elevated. They were dehydrated and hungry, but otherwise they seemed unharmed. That evening, as Sarah was helping the children prepare for bed, James approached her with a strange request. "Miss Sarah, can you write something down for us?" "Of course. What would you like me to write?" "The others are waiting," James said, his young face serious. "The ones who left. They want us to come." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Come where?" "To the place where it started. Where the water comes to the land. Where the first ones were brought. They're showing us the way." "Who's showing you?" "The ones who remember. The ones who held the language inside so it wouldn't be lost. They want us to come so we can remember everything. So we can tell the story that needs to be told." Sarah wrote down his words exactly, then asked gently, "James, do you want to go to this place?" The boy considered the question seriously. "I don't know if I want to, but I think I need to. We all need to. It's like a calling, like something pulling us there." "Where is this place?" "South, where the trees grow in the water, where the old places are. I can see it in my head. We all can." He was describing the Sea Islands, the barrier islands south of Savannah, where rice plantations had operated for over a century, where some of the earliest slave ships had landed, their human cargo unloaded onto docks built specifically for that purpose, where countless thousands had first touched American soil after surviving the Middle Passage, where unmarked graves held more bodies than anyone had ever counted. Sarah reported this conversation to Edmund, and his response shocked her. "Perhaps we should take them," he said. "Perhaps being in that location will trigger something that will help us understand what they're experiencing." "Edmund, you can't be serious. Take 7 vulnerable children to an abandoned island based on a mystical vision. That's not medicine. It's the only lead we have. Nothing else is working, Sarah. No treatment has been effective. No medical intervention has provided answers. Maybe a different approach is needed. Maybe we need to meet this phenomenon on its own terms." Sarah was horrified, but also intrigued. The rational part of her mind recognized the idea as potentially dangerous and definitely unorthodox. But another part, the part that had been listening to the children for weeks, documenting their experiences, coming to believe that something genuine and important was happening, saw potential value in Edmund's proposal. They argued about it for days. Sarah insisted that if they went, it had to be with proper precautions, adequate supplies, and backup plans in case things went wrong. Edmund agreed, but also insisted that they move quickly before the county commissioners decided to end the infirmary arrangement and send the children back to their plantations. Time was running out. On November 8th, Edmund wrote a formal proposal to the commissioners requesting permission for therapeutic excursion to coastal environment for patients exhibiting nervous conditions potentially responsive to environmental factors. He framed it in medical language, citing theoretical benefits of sea air and change of scenery for treating neurological disorders. The proposal was approved with surprising speed. Sarah suspected that officials were tired of the ongoing situation and willing to support any approach that might resolve it. The expedition was arranged for November 10th. Edmund chartered a boat to take them to Ossabaw Island, one of the largest barrier islands, site of several abandoned rice plantations that had been operational in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The island was largely uninhabited now, the plantation infrastructure slowly being reclaimed by nature after yellow fever and economic failures had driven the owners away. Sarah spent the day before their departure preparing supplies and trying to calm her nerves. She had a deep sense of foreboding about the trip, a feeling that they were approaching some kind of threshold beyond which things would change irreversibly. She wrote in her journal that night, "Tomorrow we journey to the Sea Islands with 7 children who claim to carry memories of the dead. Edmund believes this is a medical investigation. I fear it may be something else entirely. I fear we are not seeking answers. I fear the answers are seeking us." They departed Savannah at dawn on November 10th, 1831. The boat was a shallow draft vessel, typically used for navigating the coastal waterways, captained by a grizzled waterman named Marcus, who asked no questions about their unusual party. In addition to Edmund and Sarah, they brought along 2 orderlies from the infirmary. Strong young men named William and Robert, who could provide security if needed, and Robert Talbot, a county official who served as both observer and legal witness. The 7 children wore donated clothing in better condition than their usual plantation garments, and Sarah had packed enough food and water for several days, though they only planned to be gone one night. The journey took most of the morning. They followed the coastal waterways south, navigating through marshes where tall grass grew from water that reflected the overcast sky. The landscape was hauntingly beautiful. Live oaks draped with Spanish moss, herons and egrets fishing in shallow channels, occasional glimpses of alligators sunning on mud banks. The children were quiet during the journey, but Sarah noticed they weren't frightened. Instead, they seemed focused, alert, watching the passing landscape with intense interest. As they approached Ossabaw Island, the children's behavior began to change. They became agitated, not with fear, but with something like anticipation or recognition. They began speaking to each other in low voices, mixing English with the unknown language. Elizabeth pointed at the approaching shoreline and said something that made the other children nod in agreement. "What did she say?" Edmund asked Sarah. "I don't know. It was in the other language." The boat landed at an old dock, half collapsed but still functional enough to tie up. The wooden pilings were green with algae, and several planks had rotted through, but Captain Marcus maneuvered carefully to a secure section. As they disembarked, Sarah noticed the children exchanging glances, clearly communicating something without words. The group made their way inland, following overgrown paths that had once been roads connecting the plantation buildings. The island vegetation was dense: palmettos, live oaks, pines, and thick undergrowth of vines and shrubs. According to Talbot, they were heading toward the ruins of Lockwood Grove, a plantation that had been abandoned in 1790 after a devastating yellow fever outbreak killed most of the resident population, both enslaved and free. The land had never been successfully resettled, multiple attempts having failed due to recurring fever, poor soil, or simply the island's isolation. Edmund noticed something strange. The children were leading the way. They weren't following the adults. They were moving ahead with confidence, choosing paths without hesitation. When the official trail forked, Elizabeth walked directly down the right branch without pausing, and the other children followed her. The adults hurried to keep up. "How do you know which way to go?" Edmund called ahead. "We can feel it," Elizabeth called back without turning around. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes through increasingly thick vegetation before arriving at a clearing. Sarah stepped through the tree line and stopped, breath catching in her throat. Before them stood the remains of slave quarters. Several small structures, roofless and partially collapsed, walls still showing traces of whitewash. Brick chimneys stood like skeletal sentinels. The ground was uneven, covered in grass and wildflowers, but outlines of former gardens and paths were still visible. The children stopped at the edge of the clearing. They stood perfectly still, staring at the ruins, and Sarah could see tears streaming down several of their faces. Then, without any prompting or signal, they began to speak in unison. The unknown language poured out of them, but this time it sounded different. Not the rhythmic chanting Sarah had heard before, but conversation. Multiple voices overlapping, rapid exchanges, questions and responses, as if dozens of people were speaking through 7 mouths. Sarah described the scene in her journal. It was not the children speaking, I know how mad that sounds, but it was the truth as I perceived it. The children's voices were the instruments, but the words came from somewhere else. Someone else. Many someones. I heard pain in those voices. I heard anger. I heard loss so profound it made my soul ache, and I heard something else too. Determination. These voices, whoever or whatever they were, wanted to be heard. They demanded to be heard. Edmund tried to intervene to examine the children, but they ignored him completely. They walked into the clearing, moving among the ruins, touching walls, tracing patterns in the dirt. And they continued speaking, an unbroken stream of words in that haunting language that went on for over an hour. Sarah noticed something extraordinary. As the children moved through the ruins, they seemed to be conducting some kind of ritual or ceremony. They arranged themselves at specific locations, one child at each former building, forming a rough circle around the clearing. They touched certain spots on the ground, on walls, on remaining foundations, as if marking or acknowledging something important. And all the while they spoke, their voices weaving together in complex patterns of sound. William, one of the orderlies, approached Sarah and whispered, "Miss Sarah, this ain't right. This ain't natural. We should take the children and leave." "Not yet," Sarah replied, though she felt the same unease. "Let them finish. They need to finish." After more than an hour, the voices began to change. The urgency faded, replaced by something softer. Sadness, but also peace. The children's speech slowed, became more measured, more rhythmic. It sounded like a song now, or a prayer. And then, one by one, each child fell silent, until only Elizabeth continued speaking. Her voice alone filled the clearing for perhaps another 10 minutes, and then she too stopped. The silence that followed was profound. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, the insects stopped buzzing, the world held its breath. Then abruptly, the children collapsed, not falling dramatically, but sitting down where they stood, as if their legs simply stopped supporting them. Edmund rushed forward, Sarah close behind. They checked each child, all breathing normally, all conscious but dazed, all looking exhausted. The youngest, Abigail, looked up at Sarah with ancient eyes. "We told them," she said in English, her voice barely above a whisper. "We told the stories. Now they can rest." "Who can rest?" Sarah asked gently. "The ones who died here. The ones buried in unmarked ground. The ones thrown in the water. The ones who never had names written down. We told their stories. We said the words that needed to be said. Now they can rest." Robert Talbot, the county official, had been standing at the edge of the clearing throughout this entire exchange. He strode forward now, his face red with anger. "This is a trick," he said loudly. "Someone's been teaching these children to perform. This whole thing is staged to... To what?" Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. She stood to face Talbot, placing herself between him and the exhausted children. "To what end, Mr. Talbot? These children have nothing to gain from this. They've been torn from their families, locked in an infirmary, subjected to examinations and experiments. Why would they perform some elaborate deception? For whose benefit? To cause trouble, to disrupt, to make us look foolish. There are abolitionists who'd pay good money for this kind of spectacle. Proof that slaves have hidden knowledge, hidden powers. It's propaganda." "Have you been listening to yourself?" Edmund said, moving to stand beside Sarah. "You sound ridiculous. These children are 7 years old, 8 years old. They're not political operatives. They're not performing for abolitionists. They're experiencing something we don't understand, something that deserves investigation, not dismissal." "I know what I've seen," Talbot said coldly. "And what I've seen is a collection of slaves being encouraged in delusions by a northern doctor who doesn't understand our ways. This investigation is over. We're returning to Savannah immediately, and I'm recommending that these children be evaluated for deliberate deception and potential punishment for false claims." "They're children," Sarah said, her voice rising. "How dare you speak of punishing them for violating the natural order?" Talbot interrupted. "For claiming knowledge they have no right to claim. For speaking languages they shouldn't speak. Slaves don't get to have mysteries, Mrs. Pierce. They don't get to be special or unusual or interesting. They exist to work, and when they can't work properly, they're sold or disposed of. That's the system. That's always been the system. The casual cruelty of his words left Sarah momentarily speechless. Edmund, however, found his voice. "Your system is monstrous," he said quietly, "and your refusal to see these children as human beings deserving of care and compassion is a moral failure I hope you come to regret. Save your northern morality for Massachusetts," Talbot replied. "You're in Georgia now. Our rules apply. Now gather these children. We're leaving." On the boat ride back, the children said nothing. They sat together at the stern, holding hands, occasionally whispering to each other in English. The trance state didn't return. The unknown language wasn't spoken again. When Sarah tried to talk to them, they responded politely but distantly, as if something fundamental had changed during their time in the clearing. As Savannah's skyline came into view, Elizabeth looked at Sarah and said very quietly, "Thank you for bringing us. We needed to go there. We needed to speak for them. Now it's finished." "What's finished?" Sarah asked. "Our part. We carried the words. We spoke them in the place where they needed to be spoken. Now the words can rest, and we can rest too." Sarah didn't understand what Elizabeth meant, but she felt tears on her cheeks. "What happens now?" Elizabeth shrugged, a gesture heartbreakingly childlike despite the old soul behind her eyes. "Whatever they decide happens to us. We're just slaves. We don't get to choose." The expedition report filed by Robert Talbot focused entirely on his suspicions of fraud and manipulation. His document, preserved in the county records, described the incident as a carefully orchestrated performance designed to elicit sympathy for slaves and undermine confidence in the plantation system. He recommended immediate dispersal of the children, separating them to prevent ongoing coordination of deceptive behavior. He also recommended that Edmund Pierce be censured for encouraging delusions in slaves and conducting medical investigations with clear abolitionist sympathies. The county commissioners reviewed Talbot's report on November 15th. Edmund was invited to respond, but his defense was barely heard. The political climate had shifted against him. Rumors of slave rebellions in other states had created paranoia among Southern authorities. Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia had occurred just 3 months earlier, in August 1831, resulting in the deaths of dozens of white people and subsequent brutal reprisals against enslaved populations throughout the South. Officials were in no mood to tolerate anything that suggested enslaved people possessed unusual capabilities or hidden knowledge. The decision was swift and final. All 7 children would be sold to different buyers, deliberately chosen from distant regions to ensure they would never meet again. The sales were arranged within a week. By November 25th, all 7 children had been removed from the Savannah area. Their subsequent fates were never recorded in any document Sarah or Edmund could access. Edmund protested vehemently, filing multiple petitions and letters arguing that the children required continued medical observation, that separating them was cruel and unscientific, that the phenomenon deserved further investigation. His protests were ignored. Several colleagues at the medical society distanced themselves from him. One former friend told him bluntly, "You've made yourself radioactive, Pierce. No one wants to be associated with slave mysticism. If you want to salvage your career, drop this matter and never speak of it again." But Edmund couldn't drop it. He spent the following months attempting to track down the children, sending letters to plantations throughout Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. Most letters went unanswered. A few replied with terse notes. Slave in question no longer property of this plantation. Current whereabouts unknown. The 4 children who had disappeared in August, Rebecca, Daniel, Jacob, and Mary, were never located. No bodies were ever found. The searches were eventually called off, officially declared as successful escapes, with assumption that the children had reached free territory. But Edmund never believed that. They were too young, he wrote in a private letter to a colleague. 4, 5, 6 years old. Children that age don't successfully navigate hundreds of miles through hostile territory to reach the north. Something else happened to them, something we don't understand. Edmund spent months attempting to identify the unknown language, expanding his efforts beyond initial queries. He sent his phonetic transcriptions to scholars throughout the South and as far as Boston, Philadelphia, and even London. The responses were varied and ultimately inconclusive. A linguist at the University of Virginia suggested the language might be a form of Gullah, the Creole language developed by enslaved people in the coastal regions of South Carolina and Georgia. But Gullah was well documented, and the sounds Edmund had recorded didn't match its patterns. A professor at Harvard proposed it might be a mixture of several West African languages, with fragments of Portuguese and English. He identified elements that resembled Mende, a language spoken in Sierra Leone, mixed with grammatical structures from Kikongo, spoken in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. But he couldn't explain how children born in Georgia would have such sophisticated fluency in languages their ancestors hadn't spoken in 2 or 3 generations. A linguistics scholar from the College of Charleston offered the most interesting theory. "What you've documented," he wrote, "appears to be a constructed language or maintained language, something deliberately preserved by a community despite all efforts to suppress it. Enslaved populations often created coded languages for communication without overseer comprehension. But this seems more complex than typical field codes. This seems like a full linguistic system, preserved with remarkable fidelity across generations. If true, it would represent an extraordinary act of cultural resistance and preservation. But none of these theories explained the children's fluency, their literacy, or the synchronized nature of their speech. The mystery remained unsolved. Sarah's journals from this period show her wrestling with multiple interpretations. Edmund believes there is a rational explanation we simply haven't discovered yet, she wrote in December of 1831. Some form of shared learning or environmental exposure that we failed to identify. He cannot accept that there might be phenomena beyond our current scientific understanding. But I cannot shake the conviction that what we witnessed was memory. Not personal memory, but something older and deeper. A kind of remembering that transcends individual experience. She continued in later entries. Those children knew things they could not have learned through ordinary means. They spoke a language that should have died, but somehow survived. They connected with something, or someone, at that abandoned plantation. And when they did, they stopped being just themselves. They became vessels for something larger, something that needed to be heard. Perhaps that's what we all are in the end. Vessels carrying forward the accumulated experiences of everyone who came before us. Perhaps memory is not individual but collective, not isolated but shared. Sarah's final entry regarding the incident is dated January 4th, 1832. It's a long, reflective piece written late at night, and it shows her still trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Edmund received word today that Dr. Bennett, the visiting physician from Charleston who was supposed to examine the children before they disappeared, has died. The cause was listed as sudden fever. He was 43 years old and had been in good health according to his colleagues. His widow sent a package containing his notes on our case. He'd been researching similar incidents in South Carolina and had found evidence of 3 other cases involving enslaved children speaking unknown languages. One case from 1823, one from 1827, and one as recent as last year. He'd planned to publish a paper arguing that these incidents represented a form of cultural preservation, languages kept alive through methods we don't understand. Those plans died with him. I find myself wondering how many other cases have occurred that were never documented, never investigated, never recorded. How many children have experienced what our 7 experienced? How many have been punished or sold or simply silenced for speaking words they weren't supposed to know? And how many more will experience it in the years to come? Edmund and I have decided to leave Savannah. The hostility has become unbearable. His medical practice has dried up. No plantation owner will hire him, and even city families avoid our services. We've received threatening letters. Someone threw stones through our windows last week. We're planning to return to Massachusetts, though Edmund says he won't practice medicine again. He feels he's failed, both as a physician and as a human being. But I don't think we failed. I think we bore witness. We documented something extraordinary, something that challenged every assumption about memory, language, and the nature of knowledge itself. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps bearing witness is its own form of success, even when we can't fix what we witness or fully understand it. I will carry those children with me for the rest of my life. I will remember their faces, their voices, their courage in the face of circumstances designed to break them. They spoke for the voiceless. They remembered the forgotten. They kept something alive that should have been lost. And for that brief window of time, we were privileged to witness them do it. Edmund's medical practice in Savannah ended in February 1832. He and Sarah returned to Massachusetts in March, settling in a small house in Worcester rather than returning to Boston. Edmund never practiced medicine again, working instead as a clerk in his brother's shipping business. He died in 1847 at age 53, his obituary making no mention of his work in Georgia or the strange case that had defined his final years in practice. Sarah lived much longer, dying in 1873 at age 72. Her journals were preserved by her daughter and eventually donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1921. They remained largely unexamined until a researcher studying abolitionist movements in the 1960s discovered the accounts of the Georgia children. The journals were then studied more extensively by historians and anthropologists interested in slave cultures and resistance movements. The courthouse records that Martha Hayes discovered in 1978 contained additional documents not initially catalogued. Among them was a single page, written in Edmund Pierce's handwriting, undated but clearly from late 1832 or early 1833. It was found folded inside one of the medical examiner's reports. I have come to a conclusion that I dare not publish and can barely admit even in this private notation. The children were not ill. They were not delusional. They were not performing or deceiving. They were remembering, not their own memories but the memories of others. Their ancestors, perhaps, or others who shared their fate. The language they spoke was real, kept alive through channels we do not understand and may never understand. And the knowledge they displayed came from somewhere real, a place of suffering so profound that it created something we have no name for. An imprint, an echo, a debt unpaid. I failed them. I treated them as medical curiosities when they were trying to tell us something vital. They were trying to make the forgotten remembered. They were trying to give voice to thousands who died nameless and unacknowledged. And for that, they were silenced and scattered. History will forget them, as it has forgotten so many others. But I will not. I cannot. If there is any justice in this world or the next, those children's words will have lasting impact. The stories they told, the memories they carried, the language they spoke, all of it will survive somehow. Because some things are too important to be lost. Some suffering demands to be acknowledged. And perhaps those children were the acknowledgement. Perhaps they were the universe's way of saying, we remember, we do not forget, and neither should you. Edmund's note ends there. No further documents from him regarding the case have been found. The records provide no information about what happened to the 14 children after 1834. None of their names appear in any subsequent documentation. It's as if they simply vanished from history, leaving behind only Edmund Pierce's notes and Sarah's journals as evidence they ever existed. The phenomenon was never officially reported again in Georgia. If similar incidents occurred, they were never recorded in county or state documents. The linguistic samples Edmund collected were lost or possibly destroyed. No academic papers were ever published about the case. The institutional response was clear. This was something to be buried, not investigated. The old Lockwood Grove plantation on Ossabaw Island remained abandoned throughout the 19th century. Modern archaeological surveys of the site, conducted in the 1990s, identified several unmarked burial areas containing the remains of dozens of individuals, likely enslaved people who died during the plantations operation or the 1790 yellow fever outbreak. Carbon dating and skeletal analysis suggested deaths spanning from the 1750s through the early 1800s. No markers identified them. No records named them. Their stories died with them, except perhaps for a brief moment in 1831, when 7 children spoke in voices that should have been silenced generations before, when they remembered what should have been forgotten, when they proved that some things survive, even when the world tries desperately to erase them. The courthouse records were briefly displayed at a historical exhibition in Savannah in 1979, as part of a program commemorating African American history in coastal Georgia. They drew modest attention from historians and some local news coverage. Within a year, they'd been returned to storage, filed away again in the climate-controlled archive room where they remain today. Martha Hayes, the clerk who discovered them, retired in 1985 after 32 years of county service. In her final interview with the Savannah Morning News, she mentioned the documents. "I've worked with historical records for 30 years, she said. I've seen a lot of strange things in old files, mysteries that were never solved, cases that were never closed, incidents that seemed impossible but were documented by reliable witnesses. But those plantation records, there was something about them that bothered me more than anything else I ever came across. Not what they said, but what they implied. That there are whole stories we'll never know. Whole lives that left no trace, except a few cryptic notes in a file no one was meant to read. And the children. I kept thinking about those children. What happened to them? Did they live long lives? Did they ever speak that language again? Did anyone ever listen to them? We'll never know. And that haunts me." She was asked if she believed the accounts in Edmund Pierce's reports. "I don't know what I believe," she replied, "but I know what I read. And what I read was the account of something that couldn't be easily explained, something that challenged the comfortable narratives we tell ourselves about the past. Maybe it doesn't need to be explained. Maybe we just need to remember that it happened. Maybe that's enough." The children spoke 2 languages. Only one of them was taught. The other survived through means no one could identify, and no one wanted to investigate too closely. It emerged in 14 children across 6 plantations over a span of months in 1831, then disappeared as quickly as it came. The official response was silence and dispersal. The historical response was forgetting, but Edmund Pierce's notes survived. Sarah's journals survived. And buried in courthouse archives across the South, there may be other records like them. Documents describing incidents that challenged everything officials understood about memory, language, and the persistence of identity under conditions designed to erase it. Contemporary researchers have attempted to reconstruct what the children might have been experiencing. Theories range from cultural preservation through coded language systems to collective psychological responses to trauma, to forms of dissociation that allowed access to stored cultural knowledge. Some psychologists have drawn parallels to documented cases of ancestral memory claims in other traumatized populations. Anthropologists have noted similar phenomena in other cultures, where oppressed peoples developed sophisticated methods of preserving identity and history despite systematic attempts at cultural erasure. But none of these modern theories fully explain the specifics of what Edmund and Sarah documented. The perfect synchronization, the literacy in a language never taught, the predictive statements, the profound sense of connection to specific historical locations. The mystery, even with nearly 200 years of hindsight, remains largely unsolved. Some questions don't have answers. Some mysteries remain unsolved, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the truth was too unsettling to pursue. The children of coastal Georgia spoke in 2 languages. One was the language of their oppressors, forced upon them by a system that tried to strip away everything that made them who they were. The other was the language of their ancestors, kept alive through means that defied every rational explanation of the time. Which language told the truth? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. But for a brief window in 1831, those children gave voice to something that should have been lost forever. They carried forward memories that weren't their own, but somehow belonged to them anyway. They spoke words that had been silenced for generations, and for that, they were scattered to the four winds, their names forgotten, their fate unrecorded. History moved on. The plantations kept operating. The ships kept arriving. The system ground forward, consuming lives and erasing identities as it had always done. But silence, as those children proved, is never absolute. Sometimes what is buried doesn't stay buried. Sometimes what is forgotten finds a way to be remembered. And sometimes the voices of the lost speak through the living in ways that can't be explained or controlled or silenced forever. The records exist. The questions remain. And somewhere in the vast landscape of history, 14 children left traces of something extraordinary. Proof that memory can survive even when every attempt is made to erase it. Proof that languages can be kept alive through sheer will and need. Proof that the human spirit resists obliteration even under conditions designed to destroy it. Sarah Pierce wrote one final entry in her journal about the case, dated 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War. She was 64 years old. Edmund had been dead for 18 years, and she'd just learned that slavery had been abolished throughout the United States. I cannot help but wonder what became of them. The 7 children we tried to help, the 4 who disappeared, the 3 who were sold before we could examine them. They would be in their late 30s now if they survived. They would have lived through this war that finally ended the system that enslaved them. I hope they survived. I hope they found freedom and peace. I hope they were able to use their remarkable abilities in ways that enriched their lives rather than endangered them. But more than that, I hope they remember. I hope they remember what they were able to do in 1831, speaking for the voiceless, carrying forward the words that needed to be spoken. I hope they know that at least 2 people witnessed them and believed them and recognized that what they did was important. I hope they know that Edmund and I never forgot them. And I hope that someday, someone will read these journals and Edmund's notes and understand what we witnessed. Not just as a historical curiosity, but as evidence of something profound. That the human capacity for memory, for language, for cultural preservation is stronger than any force that tries to destroy it. Those children proved that. They proved that some things survive. Some things endure, some things refuse to be forgotten. May their memories be blessings, may their words echo through time. May the stories they carried forward continue to be told in whatever form they take, in whatever voices speak them. They deserve to be remembered, all of them. The 14 children, the countless ancestors whose memories they carried, the thousands who died nameless on ships and plantations and in unmarked graves. They all deserve to be remembered. And now, finally, after 34 years, I can rest knowing I've recorded what I witnessed. I've borne witness. I've remembered. Perhaps that's all any of us can do. Remember. Bear witness. Refuse to forget. Perhaps that's enough. Sarah's journals ended shortly after that entry. She died 8 years later in 1873 and was buried beside Edmund in a Worcester cemetery. Her gravestone makes no mention of her time in Georgia or the children she tried to help. But the journals survived, passed down through her family, eventually making their way into historical archives where they wait to be read by anyone seeking to understand the full complexity of America's past. The mystery of the children who spoke 2 languages remains unsolved. But perhaps solving it isn't the point. Perhaps the point is simply remembering that it happened, remembering that 14 children carried something precious and gave it voice against all odds, remembering that memory itself is an act of resistance, and remembering that some debts can never be fully paid, only acknowledged. They spoke. We heard. And now, nearly 200 years later, the echo of their voices still demands our attention, still challenges our assumptions, still insists that we remember what the world tried so hard to forget. If this story left you thinking about the countless untold histories still buried in forgotten archives, I have dozens more like it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories that make us question everything we thought we knew about the past. And if this one got under your skin the way it got under mine, share it with someone who loves history's darkest mysteries. Thanks for watching. Until next time.